My name is Anais. I'm a PhD candidate based in Brisbane. Claudio did a very accurate presentation of me. So I am based in Brisbane in Griffith University, but I'm French. I grew up in Paris, and I just came back from 4 months of intense fieldwork in Paris during the Paris 2024 Olympic events, but we'll get to that in more details later. So my research is supervised by Associate Professor Michael House, Dr. Aishin Dedekor-House, and Dr. Millicent Kennelly. So some of them are in the audience, I think. And today I'm going to present part of our research, which is focused on the Olympics as a catalyst to decarbonize city transport systems, with a focus on Paris 2024. So the focus of today's presentation is on Paris 2024 Olympic and Paralympic Games as a case study, even though my PhD is part of a larger project, but more details about it later in the presentation. So today's presentation will be around 35 to 40 minutes, and I will leave 20 minutes, around 20 minutes at the end for any questions that you can have. But during this session, I will also ask you to interact with me a little bit to make the session more engaging. So I have a few warm-up questions. If you can click on the React button, raise your hand. So my first question to all of you is, have you already attended some sessions or events on urban transport in the past? So feel free to put the React button question. So nice. So a few of you are familiar with this general topic. That's great. So for those who are not familiar, don't worry, I won't overcomplicate things and make the content accessible for everyone. Another warm-up question, you can click on the button, raise your hand if you have watched some Paris 2024 Olympic events this year. Okay. Okay, so it seems that there is some interest in this exciting topic then. And also another question, if you have ever attended an Olympic event in your life, feel free to press the React button as well. Okay, so there are fewer people now, but I get it. The tickets are expensive, so yeah. So yeah, thanks for participating. It's always good to see how many people are familiar with this exciting topic that mixes the Olympics, but also climate change and urban transport. So let's start with some background context to set up the topic and identify the issues our research will tend to address. So first, climate change is an urgent issue, and to address climate change, it is essential to implement more robust intervention in key polluting sectors, such as transport, that are major emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, as you can see in this graph that was made by the IPCC. You can see that the contribution of the transport sector to a global greenhouse gas emission is the red rectangle, which is, it's not the worst, but it's still a major contributor to global emissions. And it is in fact among the sectors that are the least likely to achieve net zero emissions in the medium term. So that's why it is essential to implement robust measures to mitigate that problem. So we have that problem on one side, and on the other side, the Olympic and Paralympic Games, one of the largest events in the world, tend to exacerbate the problem of transport emissions, mainly due to, by nature, increasing travel demand in host countries. So first we have the International Olympic Committee, which is the authority responsible for organizing the Games and leader of the Olympic movement. They committed to address climate change with this target to be climate positive by 2030. So I'd like you to participate in the chat and answer to the following questions. So it can be a simple yes or a simple no. You can develop further if you want. But do you think that the Olympic and Paralympic Games can, in fact, in reality, become climate positive? So feel free to share your thoughts. You can just say yes or no in the chat. So I don't, oh yeah, okay, I can access the chat now. So, okay, most of the responses are no. I have a few yes. If they include flights of all attendees, yes. Not if they include travel, depends. Yes. So yes, actually, it's not a yes or no questions. And we don't have the full answer yet because we're not in 2030. But as you can see, this target was actually updated by the IOC. So first, the idea is the climate positive term was a main instrument for communication from the IOC. The target was appearing everywhere, but then it suddenly disappeared, at least from the official website, and it has been replaced by the following climate target, reducing the emissions of the game by 50% by 2030. Which is it's not the same thing as being climate positive. So that could mean that they realized that their climate target was either too ambitious or that the climate positive term was too broad. Either way, they have three terms that they are advocating to reduce their environmental footprint. Is reduce, compensate, influence. And even if this target has been reformulated and we can discuss and debate about it, their climate target is still more ambitious than before. And I am looking at what opportunities that could give, namely to urban transport decarbonization. So therefore, hosting the games can have a significant environmental impact on one side, but it can also present a good opportunity to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable transport system to comply with this IOC new climate criteria. So I created this into a conceptual diagram to frame the hypothesis of this research and set up an ideal scenario on how transport could effectively play its part in reaching the IOC climate targets. So the hypothesis would be that to comply with the IOC climate targets, transport emissions are supposed to start decreasing during the lead-up phase, have a massive drop during the event phase, and gradually reach net zero emission after the events. So the general outcomes will be to achieve urban transport decarbonization, meaning reducing emission from the transport sector to mitigate climate change. And the process to achieve this would be transformative change, which involves a fundamental and system-wide reorganization across many factors, so namely technological, economic, institutional, and social factors. So this conceptual framework is an ideal scenario, and the data collection activities of our research will help to validate or invalidate this hypothesis. So this research aims to determine what past, present, and planned changes will help decarbonize urban transport systems to support the climate targets of the games. So if we break this down a little more, it aims to identify how transport-related climate change mitigation strategies may be applied in the context of a mega event. It aims to learn lessons from past games and guide future mega events towards urban transport decarbonization. And it also aims to identify consensus and debates, offer expert insights, and bridge theory and practice gaps. So our first preliminary study was conducted 2 years ago with part of the research team on the best practice recommendations suggested in the literature for decarbonizing urban transport systems effectively. This study was done outside the context of the games with a comparative case study between Paris and Brisbane. And the part of Brisbane was actually turned into an academic paper in the Australian Planner Journal that came out last year. If you want, it's accessible on Google Scholar. You can also email me if you want a copy of it. And this graph highlights the methods of our current research in general. So I won't go too much into detail because the focus of today's session is Paris, but first I have done a literature review. And then I'm conducting actually several case studies on specific host cities, but I will give details about it in a moment. So yeah, I am currently in the fieldwork phase, which involves several research methods called the participant observation methods, semi-structured interviews, and workshops to be conducted in the future. And the secondary data collected or through document search strategies. So you can see the different sources of documents in the green blocks. And so to set up a bit the topic, I'm going to talk about the first chapter of our research, which is a literature review called an SQLR, a systematic quantitative literature review. So the goal was to stock the state of knowledge about the topic in the literature, what is said, what is missing. So this specific method, the SQLR, consists of basically quantitatively synthesizing data across studies and analyzing trends, patterns, and the gaps in the research topic in a systematic manner. So in short, it means being a bit more explicit about how the data was collected for the review. So I was looking on the state of knowledge in the literature to answer the following question. So what factors tend to increase or decrease greenhouse gas emission from urban transport in the context of hosting the games? So I structured the review using the three-circle method to determine the final sample of papers and their relevance. So the three circles that you can see here represent the three areas of disciplines that my topic covers. So namely event management, transport planning, and climate policy. So the idea is to use a transdisciplinary approach. And the relevance of the papers to the topic and the research question were classified into 3-star papers, to 2-stars and 1-stars papers. So what you can see in the red circle show what was included actually in the final sample of the reviews. So the 3-stars papers are the papers that directly address the question, but some 2-stars paper were also included. And then the data from the selected paper was then extracted and classified by themes through what is called the coding process that created several categories representing key themes to be analyzed from the study's findings. And from there, we got the result that I'm going to talk about now. So an overview of what the research says on transport decarbonization in Olympic host cities in general. There is actually a growing research attention on the following Olympic events. So Beijing 2028, London 2012, Rio 2016, and Beijing 2022. As you can see in the graph on the top right, there is research dominance on the bottom right, sorry. There is a research dominance in the following disciplines, so the climate and the transport fields, and compared to the sports and event management field where there is not much research done from this type of journal. So it shows a need for research collaboration across the different disciplines. And on the topic in general, research on urban transport strategies in Olympic host cities, there is a clear lack of focus on the decarbonization aspects. So it shows that there is actually a research gap on decarbonization in this topic. So now going to the key findings to answer our question, what factors tend to drive emissions up or down from urban transport in the context of hosting the games? So regarding the economic and technological factors, which are pivotal in driving emissions up and down in transport within host cities, So first, we can say that hosting the games increases travel demands and therefore traffic congestion as well, which tend to exacerbate urban emissions. And on the other hand, on the positive side, hosting the games enhances the city's attractiveness internationally, which tends to prompt significant investments in transport infrastructure. And these investments tend to be directed towards additional low emission transport networks. So it could be electric vehicles and mainly public transport networks. It tends to be directed more towards more innovation strategies in cleaner transport technologies, for example, buses using alternative fuels, and also traffic management strategies and improvement in information systems. And the games, regarding policy and social factors, the games can lead to the implementation of more transport emission regulations, including driving restrictions and vehicle emission standards, which help reduce emission during and after the events. Also, hosting the games accelerates commitments to more sustainable infrastructure and transport plans and projects. Although some aspects can also slow down decarbonization efforts, such as poorly managed institutions or an unstable socio-political context. And lastly, social travel behavior patterns are a key indicators of emission levels actually within a host city, especially the ratio of public transport versus car usage. So yeah, this is basically the key findings of this review, and it's going to be published soon. If you want to hear more about it, feel free to have a chat with me. But the focus of today's presentation is not actually on the literature review. My research is part of a larger project. The idea is to apply the key findings to specific host cities. So I'm doing a case studies on London, Paris, and Brisbane, a comparative case study analysis. But the focus of today will be for Paris to identify the dynamics of what happens during the games. But the idea is to have a past, present, and future analysis. So now that we have the background context of the topic, we know what the literature says on urban transport decarbonization strategies in the context of hosting the Olympic and Paralympic Games. We can zoom in on the Paris case. So first, a few weeks after our Paris 2024 Olympic event, we can ask ourselves, what is the baseline for Paris in terms of sustainable mobility? So I try to summarize this into this table, which highlights the strengths and weaknesses of Paris transport systems from an environmental perspective. So the first component to highlight is the city's high density, which can be actually both a strength and a barrier in terms of emissions. It is a strength because it favors public transport and active mobility usage. However, a high urban density can also drive emissions up due to congestion issues, a well-known problem in Paris, actually. So this problem includes congestion in public transport systems, but also in roads. So going back on the strengths, Paris has actually a good amount of cycling path network. Within the past decades, it increased its effort to electrify its transport networks and extend its pedestrian zones. And it has been proven from the literature that such type of measures tend to mitigate emissions. However, Paris often faces some lack of social acceptance for certain transport decarbonization strategies, namely a reluctance to change from Paris residents. I can give the example of some road construction for more cycle paths, of closing of roads for pedestrian areas. And also a main barrier to highlight is the operational delays that Paris faced for some major public transport projects initially meant to be fully ready before the games and were not actually ready on time. So now, if we embed all these aspects in the context of the Games, so as a reminder, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, set some climate targets for the Games events. And the IOC also has more specific targets for each event. So for Paris 2024, the goal was to cut the environmental footprint of the Games by half compared to the previous editions. So the baseline was the average of London 2012 and Rio 2016. The initial target was to be climate neutral, but then they removed these targets and they replaced it by this one. So the target has been revised. But this still gives a key opportunity for Paris to attract more funding and to accelerate projects for more sustainable transport strategies. So in the transport field, various initiatives can be qualified as more sustainable projects that have been implemented recently. And even though some have not necessarily been initially designed for the Games, these projects have been truly accelerated in terms of investment, but especially in terms of deadline so that they can be ready for the Games. So it means that the Games served as a catalyst for further investment and a clear deadline for more sustainable transport projects. So some of them, I've mentioned some of them in this graph here. So we had the extension of some major public transport line, especially line 14. We had Paris has built 30 kilometers of extra cycle path to connect Olympic venues together by bike, specifically for the Games. Some Olympic projects also involve new pedestrian areas, for example, Le Bourget, where roadways were redeveloped into public spaces for pedestrians and cyclists. The bus fleet also has known some electrification with more electric buses has been deployed, 232, I think, before, and the goal was to deploy them before the start of the Games. And also some major transport stations were upgraded, leading to new transit-oriented developments. And transit-oriented developments in general are encouraged by the literature regarding decarbonization. So it means that the Games were not just a global sporting event, but also for an opportunity for host cities to, especially Paris, to rethink its urban infrastructure. So campaigns have actually been deployed by the city with the willingness to leave a lasting legacy in terms of sustainable mobility. So all these aspects that I've mentioned here seems very positive, but not everything was a foregone conclusion, and Paris still faced some challenges in the lead-up phase of the Games. So the first one to mention was some social reluctance. So I've noticed that the enthusiasm regarding the Paris Game from the resident was not initially unanimous, especially because they were expecting chaos, and I witnesses a lot of complaints around me, but also in the media and in social media. This reluctance can be explained by several things, which leads me to the next barriers that I mentioned in these slides. So as we said, Paris is a very dense and highly populated city that has major congestion issues in roads, but also in public transport systems, where the transport supply is struggling to meet transport demand, especially during peak hours. And this issue kind of deteriorated the convenience of taking public transport despite its extensive network, which is a barrier to decarbonization. Also, traffic jams are a barrier to decarbonization, as well as they emit more emissions. And especially with the Games, where a lot of roads were planned to be closed to cars during the events, which could lead to more congestions. And also another barrier to mention is the fact that the city has a massive public transport project called the Grand Paris Express. It was designed even before the Paris 2024 bid. It is the largest metro expansion project in Europe, with 200 kilometers of new automated metro lines to transform the greater Paris area and connect the suburbs, to better connect the suburbs to each other. But at the bidding stage, actually, the initial promise was that most of the project should have been ready before the start of the game, but it ended up facing like huge delays where only a few lines were ready before the games. Other punctual events to mention that brought new uncertainties before the start of the games are a series of fires hit French railroad line just hours before the opening ceremony, with acts of vandalism and sabotage where more than 800,000 passengers were affected. Also, the day before the opening ceremony, an anti-Olympic protest occurred in Paris to denounce the anti-social and environmental consequences of the events. And a few weeks before the start of the games were the European election, where the far right came out on top in France, and following his party's defeat, President Macron announced the dissolution of the National Assembly, the lower house of the French Parliament, and the calling of new legislative election. So the following weeks after that were marked by a great political and social instability with numerous tensions. But these tensions, we could say that they temporarily faded away as soon as the game started and brought back patriotism, enthusiasm, and unity. But regarding transport, we could witness some accelerated decarbonization effort in a number of aspects. So part of these efforts were made to achieve the announced target by the region and the state to provide 100% access to all venues by public transport. So to achieve this target, some extra measures were implemented, namely some extra transport agent deployed to assist passengers. Also, a dedicated navigation app was created that automatically detected trips to Olympic venues and uploaded to the trip an access plan to the venue after going out of the station. And also the app indicated the environmental impact of each trip with the CO2 amount saved compared to the same trip done by car. And the recommended public transport trips in the app were calculated actually according to congestion estimations to distribute the passengers more efficiently. And also a dedicated website was also created to indicate congestion levels estimation during the games. So while most Paris residents were initially expecting chaos and congestion issues, public transport demand was in fact lower than usual because many Parisians left for vacation during the events or were working from home, also thanks to massive campaigns that were deployed by the state and by the region to encourage Paris residents to work from home. So other transport decarbonization measures that we could witness during the game. So as part of the Grand Paris Express project, a major metro line, line 14, was newly extended to the Orly Airport, involving major infrastructure upgrades. So these are pictures that I took during my fieldwork there. So you can see a photo of the Pleyel station, not far from the Olympic Village that just opened before the games. Also regarding the extra 30 kilometers of cycle path that was created for the games. So these cycle paths were painted in pink, which actually facilitated commuting by bike, especially with the many roads that were close to cars, as shown also on the bottom of the picture in the bottom, where we can see some roads that were close to car near Olympic venues. Also, regarding disability, dedicated shuttles were deployed for disabled people. So some shuttles were deployed in major stations in Paris, but also dedicated electric shuttles were also available within Olympic venues themselves, as shown in the pictures here. So based on what we discussed and your guess, here is another question that I will ask you to be involved in. So you can type your guess in the chat. So do you think that hosting the Olympic and Paralympic Games can significantly transform urban transport systems towards decarbonization? So I put the word transformation in bold. So the question can be rewarded this way. Do you think that the impacts of the game is such that it leads to a real transformation towards a more sustainable transport model? Or on the contrary, do you think that the impact of the game is rather marginal? So you can reread the question and you can answer your thoughts in the chat. So you can answer if you want a little bit more guidance between the following options. So yes, it's a major catalyst, somewhat, but other factors matter more. No, it's just a temporary focus, or I'm not sure. All right, so. Okay, so we have a variety of answers here. Actually, there is some truth in all of your answers. It is actually not a yes or a no, but it is more a yes but or a no but. So I asked that same question to experts actually. So these were experts. Mainly transport expert involved in the Paris 24 Games. So it was whether transport advisors for policymakers or for Olympic organizations, also research directors or technical expert for transport company, but also academics. And here are the main answer that came up so far. So yes, the games are indeed a catalyst for accelerating transport decarbonization projects because the games give an extra pressure for the whole city to give a good image on the international scene. So it's kind of secure shorter deadlines to deliver projects toward urban transport decarbonization. And it also pushes stakeholders to reschedule their investment over a shorter period. However, the games do not necessarily catalyze transformative change towards urban transport decarbonization. Yes, it catalyzes change, but this change is not necessarily transformative in the sense of involving fundamental and system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, institutional, and social factors. And the reasons for that that the experts brought me is that usually the main projects towards urban transport decarbonization are usually already existing regardless of the games. And also what they all pointed out is that the existing transport network in the whole city is the thing that will make the main difference in achieving the climate targets. And the time frame actually between the bid and the game is often too short to fully transform transport systems. So I was also looking at what key lesson can be learned from Paris 2024 for future host cities. So I asked the experts involved in the Paris 24 Games for some best practice recommendations. So the top 5 instruments that came up more often for future host city to use to decarbonize their transport system effectively were to first plan ahead, then to develop transport modeling and planning tools in advance, and to plan strategies according first to the mobility needs of the region of the city and not just for the games, especially for the legacy to have an appropriate legacy. And some of them also advise to increase salaries for public transport staff to fidelize them, especially the drivers, and to make the temporary measures implemented for the games permanent. So I will wrap up this presentation by talking more about the significance of our research in general. So my PhD research is actually a call for climate action in a key polluting sector, but it can be useful not just for people in academia, but also key stakeholders that can be involved in the organization of the games to better prepare for achieving the IOC climate targets through urban transport decarbonization. It can also have some novelty in comparing cases in different stages of the process of hosting the games. So the stages of today's session was the event phase, but I'm studying the legacy phase with London 2012 and the lead-up phase with Brisbane 2032. And this research will also address a research gap, as mentioned in the literature review, because there is a research gap on urban transport decarbonization within the Olympic context research. And this last slide is a call for participant, actually, because as you have seen, my data collection, part of my data collection is based on interviewing experts and professionals. So I will need more insight from people directly involved on the ground. So if some of you in the audience is an expert or a professional currently involved in the transport fields or in the sustainability field, whether in London, Paris, or Brisbane, feel free to contact me by email, and we can plan to meet whenever you are available. I would love to hear your insight and experience, which could be very valuable for my research. So my email is on this slide. You can also contact me if you know some people of interest. So thank you, everyone. This is the end of the presentation. So I guess the last 20 minutes will be a Q&A session. So I will stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you so much, Anais. That was a really, really interesting talk, and it plays excellent to our project as well. It is really fabulous. Thank you so much for doing this. And yes, please, to all attendees, shoot away. You have an expert here for city transport questions. I am sure there are many questions around. Just raise your hand and then ask your question. So the chat was very active. Nobody wants to speak up. Strange. Anyway,
Yeah.
so I have one. So you were talking about well, the public transportation, and that many Parisians were actually either staying at home, working from home, or they left for holidays. And I heard this from other people from Paris as well, that, oh, it was fantastic because the city was never that quiet in the summer while during the Olympics. So if you then take statistics about public transport and you say, oh, yes, the Olympic Games were there and it is less traffic, less congestion, this very much skews the results, kind of, because it is not really compared. So how do you deal with that? Or what are your thoughts about this?
Yes, yes, it has to be, because the games are a very unique period. So obviously I could witness myself that the transport demand, at least in public transport system, which is the main transport options for people commuting in Paris, was lower than usual, and that the peak hours were pretty different from the usual peak hours, and it was actually related to some Olympic events, the hours of Olympic event rather than the morning or the end of the day. So that's why I was also doing my participant observation work before the games and also a little bit after while I was there to kind of compare what are the main differences when the games are happening and when the games are not happening, and if we can get some inspiration of any measures that have been implemented temporarily for the game on maybe a more permanent ways. At least it was what was advocated, strongly advocated from the people that I interviewed. They said, yes, we can witness that when we put the resources, this can work. There is no congestion issues. So maybe they are actually hoping that there will be greater resources invested for the future to take inspiration from what has been done in Paris.
Okay, thank you very much. Yvonne, please go ahead. You have a question.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Anais, so much for this presentation. It was very interesting to see. I myself have been working also a little bit on the transport sector, so I'm very interested in that. And on one of the slides, you have been saying that the extension of the cycling paths and the increased pedestrian areas would decrease GHG emissions, according to the literature. But did you actually look into how much those kind of measures would decrease emissions in a quantitative way?
I'm more looking at the qualitative side of it, but generally what the literature says is that the main difference would be within public transport systems. But yeah, the fact that the modal share, the increasing for cycling and commuting by walk does have an impact on reducing the environmental footprint of the transport sector. At least this is part of the main recommendations from the literature. But yeah, I would say if you compare, it's more marginal, I would say, that public transport, but it's still a key component in the strategies to decarbonize urban transport effectively. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think there are many questions in the chat. So I will try to have a look at them. There near.
Yeah.
So we have one question from Claudia. Are there any recommendation for future management of urban transformation to increase public and business acceptance? Example, some decision like price increases for public transport have lowered social acceptance. Well, at least for Paris, the region has increased the prices during the events of the public transport tickets. Well, the price is almost doubles. And this measure has created a lot of controversies and debates, meaning that it could lower it did actually lower social acceptance because it created a lot of controversies and even some social tension, saying that it could create inequalities for low-income residents. So they kind of caught up with it by doing massive campaigns for Paris residents to buy their tickets in advance, to not so that it's not affected for people having unlimited passes that are usually more Paris residents more than tourists, and to actually charge more the international tourists. And they were using that argument that it could fund, that this price increases would fund the extra resources that were deployed for the game in public transport system, regarding like the extra transport agents, the fact that the frequency of the metro lines were increased by a minimum of 30%, but it could go to 90% at the end. So I'm just rewording the words of the experts that were working for policymakers and like the state or the region. So these are their arguments. We can agree, we can disagree, but at least it was the argument to justify the price increase. But yes, a price increase itself, yes, has an impact on social acceptance, definitely.
I would have another, well, I have two questions. One is, so you kind of left out people. You're looking at the transport and moving within the city during the games, but there's quite a lot of people actually flying to Paris or to France.
Yeah.
So do you think if you would account for the extra travel of people going to France, that an Olympic game can ever be neutral, if you take that into account as well?
Well, if you want my opinion, it will be no. But why am I saying that? Is that in the emission measurements of the International Olympic Committee, they only take into account the emissions of the territory of the host city. So it could be the region or the city. But international air travel is not considered in their emissions. So that's why back then they could afford to use the term climate positive or climate neutral, or even reducing emission by 50%, because if you account international air travel, which is overall, even if that's not the focus of my study, but overall this is the main factor that indicates the level of emissions in the transport sector in general. Yeah. So yeah, that's probably why they don't take into account international air travel into their emissions measurements. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Claudia,
so we have,
go ahead. Sorry. Nice.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we just had a question. Does the city monitor number of cyclists? Do you know how the numbers change from before the Olympics to during it to after? But yeah, even already, thank you for already responded. The city monitored the number of cyclists. So it is publicly available online. Yes. So yeah, Claudia, you had a question?
Yeah, I had a follow-up question actually on the travel to the Olympics. Given that Paris is a city with a very high baseline of tourist travel anyway, is there any data on what the actual increase in air travel was in terms of increased number of flights offered or not? Because that was also a little bit in the public debate, that basically the same number of people come to Paris only for a different purpose.
Yeah. I'm not studying international air travel, but since it's not in the IOC measurements, I'm studying what can be done to achieve the IOC climate target with their frames. But I'm sure there will be some data available in the next few weeks to come. If someone know the data, feel free to upload it in the chat. But yeah, there will be some data available, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.